I want to get into kind of a framework that you've developed to bring some clarity to those gray areas. So how do you distinguish the right path if you're that leader making the decision?
Well, the first thing you do is go back to your core values. Again, the situation itself is not just going to suggest the moral grid that you need to be operating from. So what do you believe? What is your organization built on? What are you committed to? You're going to have to come back to that. And I'll explain in a minute that Churchill did that. He went to his core values. What's my role? What's my job? What am I here to accomplish? What do I believe? And that really, and I don't mean that belief can mean religion, but I mean beyond religion. What's your company committed to? What are the core values that you're built upon? We believe in the individual, or we believe we're doing this. We're trying to alleviate poverty. We're trying to sell this. We're trying to accomplish this in a certain amount of years. Those core values help you decide, make those critical decisions. But the problem is that it's like pulling apart spaghetti. So how do you decide what's most important? It's going to be your core values. You need to stay in touch with them. You need to have people around you who will hold them up to you, because a leader can easily get removed from their core values. And you need to be rehearsing them often. That's why I'm a big believer in putting them on the wall and tattooing them on your arm and producing T-shirts and everything else.
Does Dave have the tats yet of our core values? That's a great question.
I haven't looked. Have you?
That's why he wears a lot of long sleeves. That's my guess. So you make these core values and you get to make decisions from this, but there's another piece of this that's the next step. And you talk about crafting your language. You talked about this earlier. We've got to start talking about this and articulating it. What does that look like?
If you'll focus on crafting your language, it will actually help you make the decision. How are you going to articulate this decision? So you have a major business decision. You're going back and checking in with your core values. But the next thing you're doing, you're saying, how will I explain them? What language can I use? And I want to say it very bluntly, because we have a lot of leaders obviously listening to this podcast. Leaders often fail, not in the action area, but in the articulating area. In our era, in our social media society, in our highly verbal era, you're going to have to articulate why you're doing what you're doing. So grappling with the language is part of what sharpens you in the decision making. Churchill did this. Other great leaders did this. They would sit and they would think, how will I articulate this to the people? It wasn't just PR. It wasn't just how can I convince them. That actually was part of the decision. We use the phrase today, elevator pitch. If you can't make an elevator pitch, you don't know what the heck you're doing, right? If I say to you right now, what's your job at Ramsey? If you can't tell me in a sentence or two, then you're at sea a little bit, right? So the battle of language is part of the battle for the clarity to make the decision. And people should pause, not just go from core values to action, but take a moment to craft the language and think it through and have people give them feedback, because that's part of the decision making. It's part of what brings the moral clarity that allows you to act.
And it sounds like there's a lot of distillation and simplification that has to happen there, because there's a lot going on and you've got to go, what is the clearest path? What is the clearest way I can say this that will connect to the team? Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely.
That's good. So you've crafted the language here, and you have this interesting step that's arrive at a slogan.
Yes.
Who doesn't love a good slogan? Why is this important?
Well, it's a distillation of the language into action. Most people act based on simple slogans in their minds. My firm does a lot of leadership crash analysis. When big leaders fail, we go in, try to fix it, try to figure out what went wrong. And people tend to act both positively and negatively based on a slogan that's in their brain. If it feels good, do it. How many lives has that ruined? Other kinds of things, each one teach one. I mean, there are things going in their head. And so what you want to do is you want to craft a slogan. I'm thinking right now of a company that I've worked with, and it's mainly military vets. And the company was having to decide in COVID, are we going to lay some people off, or how are we going to get through this financially? And finally, they decided they were going to ask everybody in the company to take a 20% reduction in pay. And they used a slogan that's actually used in the military, no one left behind. Now, in the military context, that means you don't leave a man shot, you don't leave him in the field, and that's very comforting to the soldiers. This company, though, borrowed that slogan and said, no one left behind. And everybody in this big company took a 20% reduction so that nobody got temporarily laid off or furloughed. And so you understand the slogan is what rallied them. I'm sure the boss could have gotten up and talked by the hour, used big words, used language, put up charts. It would not have motivated anybody. A lot of people, most people, have got certain slogans in their head, and that's what prompts action. So a wise leader will go from core values to the language, the battle of language, and then come up with a slogan, come up with a phrase, come up with a brief motto that will rally action, like this company. And that company now, by the way, is back to paying beyond their original salaries, but they kept everybody on board because they were able to rally people around a core value.
That's incredible. And as we're talking about this, it makes me think of how Dave Ramsey led in 2020.
Yes.
And he's following these exact steps. I don't know if he did it intentionally going, I'm going to walk through Stephen Mansfield's principles here, but I remember in 2020, our slogan, it was hope is greater than fear.
Yes.
And that was internal, it became external.
Yes.
As he led through this weird gray area in this weird time, and we had our principles, and we crafted the language, and we got to the slogan.
Well, Dave's a great leader, and this is what great leaders do. If you read the great leaders, if you read the lives of the great leaders, they almost always come to language that motivates people. I mean, this is Lincoln, this is Churchill, this is all the great leaders. So, Dave's read enough history and just viscerally senses that this is what he should do. People, and we could talk for hours about the difference that slogan made, but that's the way it is with great leadership. And most leaders miss that step because leaders themselves have got the decision going in their head. They don't think they have to articulate it well, but it's not just how you sell it and the PR side, but it's how you motivate people. How can you embed in people's hearts values expressed through language that will cause them to act and act courageously?
Yeah, and this is not a cheesy marketing campaign.
No.
When you're the leader, it's not, well, my team's going to think this is weird if I come up with a slogan. This is really important, especially as it gets to the next part. It's not just a slogan you put on a billboard and give up. You talked about this earlier. You've got to narrate. What does that look like?
Narrating means you've got to explain to people over and over and again why you're doing what we're doing. It's like if you and I are out to lunch and I just say to you, well, now remember, we believe in so-and-so. Remember, we did this. How many times have you been in a meeting and somebody said, guys, remember, we did this originally for this certain reason. Everybody goes, yeah, that's right. We did that for that certain reason. And now they're all unified again. And so you've got to narrate. You've got to have your speech down. You've got to say it in long paragraphs and short phrases. You constantly narrate what you're doing. There's a principle of leadership every leader needs to know. If you're asking people to follow them, show them your map. If you're asking people to follow them, show them your map. And narrating is not just talking on by the hour, trying to convince them with an abundance of words. It's showing them the map. How did we arrive here? How did we come to this decision? Why are we doing what we're doing? This company that I'm referencing repeatedly that decided not to lay anybody off. I was there when this happened. The leader said, this is what I believe. This is what I believe we can do. This is what I believe is important about this company and about our culture. We can model something. And he showed them his map. He showed them his entire grid, so to speak, of how he got there. And people rallied to it. And that, in fact, when it was the only meeting I've ever been in where a wage reduction was announced and everybody stood up and applauded. The guy got a standing ovation. Why? Wow. Because he narrated it well. He condensed it to a slogan. He really called out destiny in a sense. He captured that core value in a few words.
Wow. It's amazing how much of leadership is really good communication.
Yes. And if you go to leadership schools these days, they don't stress that. One of the things my firm does is we coach leaders in DC, and it's amazing what happens when somebody who's gotten to their certain height based on their natural skills as a speaker, get some tactics, get some coaching, get some input, and how much further they can go, how much more they can impact people, how the crowds grow, to put it crassly, because communication is a major part of leadership. In fact, I would say that half of leadership is communication. Yeah. And when you think about it, think about the great leaders. There are always people who communicate well. You and I can't sit here and name one leader who just was mumble-mouthed and never could speak and never could put string sentences together. It's the main tool of leadership.
Yeah, and it's one of those things we look to in a president to be a great communicator and a great orator.
Yes.
So that's an interesting thing.
And you can see the difference between the two. Okay, I don't want to get political here with you, but like Trump or not, he at least won his audiences with his unusual manner. Mr. Biden, not so much. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are politically. Just looking at their communication styles. Reagan, brilliant. Bush, not so much, you know? And so this is part of the art of that thing. This is really part of the art. The thing that's happening is that they used to say that communication was going to be less and less critical when it came to leadership, but I think it's dramatically increasing. It's dramatically increasing. If you can't get on the air and articulate why you're doing what you're doing, you're not leading.
Yeah.
So you're just not leading. And people are going to blanch at that because it almost as though I'm trying to make every leader into some kind of, orator or, somebody who does really well with words. But you just have to be. You just have to be. And there are good people in D.C. where I work failing all the time to rally people to good causes because they don't communicate well. And that's a tragedy.
Yeah. And communication is a big part of this, but we talk about taking action as the next step. So we can talk all day long, but we've got to do something about it.
Yes. You got to actually act. The other part of our society, our social media and high verbal society, is people talk forever and never act. But act and act decisively. Churchill said things do not get better by being left alone. If they are left alone, they explode with a horrible detonation. And he was always joking about that. But you have to act, and you have to let your action be seen. And it's not just symbolic action. It's not just something that you do for show. You have to be decisive in your action, and you have to act clearly. Part of the problem in D.C., a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of this isn't acceptable, a lot of, this is what I want to do, and we have to do this, we have to do that, and then nobody actually acts. So the fact that somebody actually acts, there's actually a veto in political world. There's actually the action that happens. The action speaks for itself.
Yeah. So we've got 5 steps there, and there's an interesting 6th one, and you say that you need to publish your position.
Yes.
What does that look like?
Well, some of the best leaders I know are people who have been convinced that they shouldn't talk very much about themselves. But I believe that a good leader, again, is always giving people a map for what he or she is doing. And so I'll tell the Churchill story in a bit, but every leader who has decided to take a certain course of action and act on a large scale has to publish that, has to get there firstest with the mostest. In D.C., we're always saying, if you want to win the PR game, get there firstest with the mostest. So put it out there. Put it in press releases. Don't give the press a chance to make up their story. Get there firstest with the mostest. Actually publish your story. Get it on the website. Get it out there in social media. Get it out there to the press. Publish your story. Tell them what's going on. And by the way, put it in story form. I was faced with this situation. I checked in with my core values. I decided that we were about this. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's the slogan we're rallying to. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. And this is how leadership works. So you have to publish the rationale, the explanation, the narration for what you're doing.
So instead of just keeping this internal, the team knows, but hey, we need to let the public know. We let our customers know.
Yeah, you can't live in your head. You can't. Leaders are sometimes cerebral people. You can't just live up inside your head. You can't live in your office. You can't live inside of a book. You have to actually think about the man on the street, right? Most politicians, I'm just keeping this political for a moment. They're thinking about they're wanting to get people to do things. They're wanting to get people to rally, and so you've got to think what's going to motivate them. I wrote a book on Churchill, and when I was writing, researching about that, there was a tank commander who was still alive, and he'd been a tank commander in Northern Africa during the war. And he said, we were losing the war, we were taking shells, and we were in horrible shape. And then we heard Churchill on the radio. And he said, this is going to be their finest hour. This is going to be our finest hour. We will create broad sunlit uplands that our grandchildren will live in. If we will sacrifice now, we will win that day. And he said, we were shouting in our tank and we were ready to go, and we turned the war around. Why? Because of a BBC broadcast by a good communicator. So this is what that's all about. And you do it over and over and over, and you can explain yourself and you make it part of your culture. Remember, ultimately, leadership is about creating a culture around you. And all these steps that we're talking about, it's about creating a culture. And when you cut into a good company, you see the culture bleeding, and it's just at every level. So this is the art.